take off, take flight with you. For we never fly, but we're flying.
Welcome, listeners of the Take Flight podcast. This is episode number 234. You are here with your amazing four hosts of Take Flight podcast, Shiwal, Pabilo, Daniel, and myself, Olu. Let's get into this week's episode where we are going to talk about the US debt and the US debt level. But before I open it up for the rest of the guys, I just thought I'll give some background and tee up this week's episode. So why is this topic actually important? Now, the US debt is at its highest level to date. Now, it's currently at 34 trillion and the number keeps climbing. Now, this debt could potentially balloon to a point of no return over the next 20 years, according to some experts. And this could send the biggest economy in the world into a financial crisis. So when we think about the economy and rank the economy, we've got the US, which GDP is around 28.8 trillion. And then just to give that some context, the second biggest economy is China at 18.5 billion. So you can see if the US was to go into a financial crisis, how this will impact the rest of the world. Now, when we measure how high debt is, what we do is we compare this to the GDP. So GDP is the gross domestic product, which is just the monetary measure of the market value of financial goods and services that a country produces. And you compare that versus debt, which is what the government owes. So, and this is really by issuing debts to the public. Now, if you look at that comparison, the US is at 118% of debt to GDP. And thinking about this metric, the higher you are as a percentage, the worse it is. So you can see they have higher debt, 34 trillion, versus their GDP, which is 28.8 trillion. Now, the income that a government makes is through taxes. So they tax the economy. So they tax individuals, organizations, and then by using that tax, so that income that they make, they spend it on schools, roads, military, social care, and then also the interest that they use to pay their debt, and also the interest to pay the debt that they've issued. Now, the government will have to borrow money if the debt, so the amount that they're planning to spend, right, exceeds what they bring in, so the income through taxes. So if that is ever the case where the income taxes is lower than how much they're spending, they will have to go out in the market just like any individual and borrow money against it. Now, how did the US get to the position that it is in? In the early 2000s, right, debt began to climb. Now, this was through military action. So lots of wars in Iraq, Afghanistan. This started to accelerate when you look at 2008, where we had the financial crisis, markets started to crash, jobs were lost, which meant there were fewer people paying taxes. If you have less employees, you have less people that are able to pay taxes. Now, after that spending, right, in 2017, there was a massive tax cut, right? This was used to try to increase the amount of jobs in the market. But as you do a tax cut, that means the government is making less income because they make their income through the taxes. And then lastly, you have to think about the pandemic, right? We had COVID. There was lots of COVID relief, COVID spending, which meant the amount of spending went up to such a point where there's a deficit. So a deficit is when you're spending more than you earn, more income, which then means you have to then borrow and take out debt. Who is the US government taking debt from? So like I mentioned before, when the US government needs to take out debt or borrowing, it borrows from the public markets. So this is through individuals, organizations, institutional investors, where they lend the government money and the government issues notes, treasuries, and bonds, right? These bonds and treasuries will have some level of interest rates. Now, this used to be sort of a small interest rate. That interest rate will be classed as a yield to the investor. Now, what we used to call this is the risk-free rate, because you say, hey, we can trust the government, we could trust the US government to always pay back their debt historically. But now that we're starting to see interest rates go so high, it's starting to build a lot of fear in the market where investors are starting to say, can they truly pay? Will they truly be able to pay? Will the debt level get so high and the interest that they have to pay to a point where they will have to default? So how does the government end up combating that? Is it goes back and issues more debts and more loans and more interest and more bonds at a higher interest rates to attract more investors in. When the interest rates are really high and very attractive, that means that people would then not go into the stock market and start investing in the stock market and stay invested into treasuries and bonds with the government, which would then mean that it will continue that cycle, because as you continue to offer those interests, those bonds, those treasury notes, your interest payments gets to such a level that it can balloon and burst. So I hope that's given the listeners a background into why this is important, how we got here. But let me open it up for the rest of the guys on the podcast, and maybe starting with ᴠɪᴇᴡs, right? Because I think what the listeners are probably wanting to hear right now is, that sounds very scary, all the stuff that Olu's mentioned. What is the solution?
Yeah, Olu, before you pass the mic to ᴠɪᴇᴡs,
Yeah.
round of applause for that introduction. Round of applause. And I also think you need to replace Kiri from our EC 3065 economics module at Brunel University. Back 15 years ago, replace him. Yeah, that was thorough. That was robust and very coherent and structured.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So, Olu, just to echo the remarks already so far, I think the intro that you shared has definitely given us a full picture of some of the complications and nuances of this challenge. Now, I think to add to that, I think it's good to give some historical context, even more than what you've added, Olu. So if you think about the US economy, if we think about two elements, one is the household, and then one is the actual US as a country and the government, etc., that you mentioned, Olu. So as a household in the US, household debt as part of household income has actually been on a good trajectory. So in 2004, which is 20 years ago, it was about 10%. There was a 10% of debt to income level per household in the US. And now in 2024, it's actually at 7.3%. So in the households, we're okay. The challenge and the issue is really at a government and national level. So if you look at that same comparison of the debt levels as a country over the GDP of the country, as Olu said, in 2024, the debt now is 34 trillion. So just to double click on that number, 34 trillion levels of debt today. Now, that 34 trillion of debt, if you look at the GDP of the country, is at 120.6%. So there's more debt than what is actually being produced by the country. And that ratio 20 years ago in 2004 was actually 60%. So it's doubled. And now it's got to the point where it's more than what the country is producing. Now, if this was an individual or a business, whatever way you look at it, if there's more debt than there is being produced, then that does start to cause significant issues, because just to service that debt, whether you've taken out a credit card or loan before, you have to pay interest on top. And the bigger that debt becomes, the higher the interest payments and less amount of money you have left over to invest in the country in other areas. So that's trying to give a scale of the potential problem we see. Now, how can we potentially solve this? Now, this is $1 trillion question, probably a $34 trillion question, actually, but we'll try and give some ideas for people to think about. So whether you're an individual or a business or a country, then you're still going to look at it in the same way. The first thing is, how do we increase income? In this case, for a country, it's how do we increase the GDP, so the overall pie that we're eating from. Can we grow it through incentivizing businesses? Can we grow it through exporting more? Can we grow it through providing incentives to company? These are different ways that you can increase the GDP, which is the pie of which you can potentially extract taxes. The other element,
before you go to the next point, in terms of, I love the fact that you said increasing the income element, so increasing the GDP. Have you thought about, like, we hear in AI right now is going to be the massive savior, right, in terms of driving productivity, innovation? there's some people when I was doing some of my research that felt like AI will solve the problem because that should impact GDP. Because as we start to do maybe self-driving cars through some of the AI models, as we start to like automate some of the workforces, that might
better now, Dan.
potentially bring up the GDP, which then have you,
Completely agree, and I think Pabilo will probably touch upon the points later on about the productivity and the innovation. But what we do see with AI, with crypto to a certain extent, with all these things coming through, that will hopefully bolster the GDP. But I think the productivity element is something that P probably can speak a lot to, which hopefully increases the pie. Just the last two that I would just quickly say is increase GDP, which is the income of the country, cut costs, and I think we've already seen in the news in the US about trying to cut benefits, welfare checks, etc. That's a way to try and reduce the cost burden of the country. And then the last one, and probably the least popular, is actually increasing taxes from where they are now. We've seen in the UK, because of the heavy money printing and stimulus during COVID, the UK has had to increase taxes to a historical high level. But that's also another level, another lever that could be pulled in terms of managing it. But it's a very big problem to solve. Those are potential solutions, but talking about them is one thing. I think implementing them is something that is a whole different ballgame.
love that, absolutely love that, Shua. Thank you. I think it's what I loved about your explanation is it's very similar to the individual. Like you mentioned, you've got the government and you've got the household, right? And the same problems that the US government are doing us, the things that you're trying to avoid. Like you mentioned, your level of I would have sleepless nights if my if my debt to income ratio was over 100%. Even like in most cases, and I know some of you guys deal with property, right? Imagine trying to get a loan from a bank and saying, "Hey, I have this much debt to income." They'll be like, "Sorry, you don't sound like a trustworthy um, creditor or person that we can invest with." So I absolutely love that, and the way you mentioned in terms of tackling it, right, are the same ways that an individual should also focus on tackling it. Now, I think that's the solution element. Daniel, why do you talk about what will happen if the government defaults? Now, I own a lot of US stocks, not only oil and gas stocks that you guys joke about, but I mainly invest in the S&P 500, right? And this is obviously a big worry of mine or topic that I think about. So what happens if the US defaults? What does that mean to me?
Answer your question, I first need to expatiate on what you said at the beginning of the podcast and talk about the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling is a limit that Congress imposes on how much debt the federal government can carry at any given time when a ceiling is reached. The US Treasury Department cannot issue any more Treasury bonds, bills, or notes. It can only pay bills as it receives tax revenues, as you alluded to, Olu. If the revenue isn't enough, the Treasury Secretary must choose between paying federal employee salaries, social security benefits, or the interest on national debt. But what actually is the US debt ceiling? The US debt ceiling was set in 1917 as a legislative restriction to determine how much money the government can borrow, and therefore places a limit on the level of national debt that the US Treasury can accumulate. The government borrows money to finance various expenditures when these exceed revenues collected through taxes and other sources. And Olu, you mentioned what those expenditures usually are. The US debt ceiling has been raised multiple times in the last few decades. The legacy of the debt ceiling is rooted in fiscal control and accountability, though over the years it's become politically charged as a divisive tool that often gets used to pass other laws and pay for other things through the same bill. So on Wall Street at the moment, everybody acknowledges a debt default would be a devastating occurrence for the markets and the economy, and most investors believe lawmakers will eventually clinch a deal as they have done in the past. But if they were to default, to your question, Olu, how bad would or could it be? At the very least, there would be a very huge sell-off on Wall Street. In its analysis by UBS, they said that the S&P 500, Olu's favorite index in the world, could fall by at least 20%. At least 20%. Of course, this is all hypothetical, but 20% is not the upper limit. That's what they're saying is the minimum. However, as we all know, it's hard to predict just how bad things could be because the US has never defaulted on its debt before. Treasuries, like Olu said, have always been seen as some of the safest investments worldwide. They're held by companies and countries around the world and used as collateral in all kinds of financial transactions. If the federal government failed to pay bondholders, it would have unimaginable consequences for the standing of the US and I believe would have a ripple effect across the whole world. The default would also weaken the US dollar, which is widely seen as the world's most important currency, given the critical role it plays in the global economy. I think a lot of currencies around the world are pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar is seen as the sort of the gold standard. Doubling down on that question, Olu, how would it affect individuals, primarily those in the US? Around the world, I think would be yet to be seen if this was to happen. But I think there are 6 common ways that I would narrow it down to. I won't go into all of them into great detail for the interest of time. The first one is interest rates and borrowing costs. If the debt ceiling isn't raised and the government defaults on its obligations, it can lead to increased uncertainty and potentially trigger higher interest rates in the financial markets. This in turn, as we know and have discussed many times on this podcast, can affect consumer borrowing costs such as mortgages, loans and credit cards, making them much more expensive for individuals. And this is something that we've seen not just in the UK over the past 12 to 18 months, but also in the US as well. Second, there could be financial market volatility. So uncertainty surrounding the debt ceiling can cause volatility in financial markets. Stock markets may experience fluctuations or downturns, impacting investment portfolios and retirement savings. Third, economic uncertainty and job market. Number 4, government services and benefits. 5, credit rating impact. So the failure to raise the debt ceiling and a potential default could lead to credit rating agencies such as Moody's and Fitch, which are well known and well regarded, to downgrade the country's credit rating. A downgrade could have a cascading effect, potentially leading to higher borrowing costs for both the government and private sectors, impacting access to credit and overall economic stability. And lastly, number 6, the one that we all care about, retirement savings and investments. So volatility in financial markets due to uncertainty surrounding the debt ceiling can affect investment portfolios, including retirement accounts, typically the 401ks in the US and IRAs, potentially causing short-term losses or fluctuations in account values. What I will end on is this has never been seen before. And I think the impact on the world could be one that is unfathomable. We all don't know how it may be. But I also think it could be a catalyst for China to become the superpower or the number 1 economy. We don't know. Of course, only the numbers you mentioned at the beginning. China is far behind, the second biggest economy. They're in the billions rather than the trillions like the US. But things, depending on the impact, the US will be impacted if they default, could be, astronomical and gargantuan in terms of the numbers. I also think it's an opportunity and to see how cryptocurrencies in this day and age will play out if the US is to default. I'd like to see how many people start to, not necessarily stable coins, which are pegged to the dollar, but maybe transactions or the movement of money around the world could come into this. Lastly, we've seen the Fed Chair Jerome Powell raise interest rates a number of times last year, and I think they were anticipating a reduction in the interest rates this year. They think they priced in 7 at the start of the year, but now they're thinking that just maybe 1 lowering of interest rates may occur this year, which is a huge stark difference between the 7 versus 1.
Daniel, thank you so much for laying out that scenario. And I think we all definitely agree with your key point that if the US defaulted, it will be catastrophic for all of our personal portfolios and also actually many aspects of a lot of people's lives, including us. One question I had listening to your great insights was, if the US was to default, where at the moment looks like a good alternative for countries to deploy a large amount of capital? Because pre-pandemic, I think people would have agreed that China looks like a great market, but post-pandemic, there's definitely question marks. India seems to be up and coming, but hasn't got to the stage yet where you'd put it probably in the same category as the US. So, where would you, based on the research that you did for your area, would you deploy your capital if you were looking at investing in a country like the US, for example? What's plan B?
50% ACG, 50% Timber Capital, guaranteed returns. There we go. Case closed.
I love that. Facts.
Oh, right. So actually, on that note, if there are any countries looking to deploy capital, please give Pabilo and myself a call anytime. We'll have to have a chat. Okay, that's the obvious answer, Daniel. Right? After that answer, what's the second? What's the third or fourth option?
I don't think China should be seen as a throwaway. I think China is still a great option to invest. I think, given my recent trip and seeing the Qatari investment, if you can invest in anything Qatari backed, that would be great, because even Qatari, in terms of London, when you look at real estate in London, stores in London, I think 80% is Qatari owned. So that's always going to be a great option. But if you're looking rather than that, I think it's not necessarily who should you invest in, but what. And I think gold at the moment, gold's going through the roof. And when you think about centuries ago, people used gold as a store of value. People use gold as a way of transaction value, etc. So I think gold's also an option as well. But this is not a financial advice. It's just my own thoughts and opinions.
Yeah, Daniel, I agree, right? And I think, well, the way to hedge, right? And again, like we said, we don't provide financial advice or recommendation, but the way to hedge your bet is really focus on emerging markets. So if you believe that there's going to be a shift away from the US and to other countries, there's certain funds and that you can invest in. I know, particularly like emerging markets, which then will focus on like China, India, Taiwan, Korea as well, and Saudi, right? So you're not having to pick one specific country, but you're basically saying, hey, the dominance that the US has had is going to slow down, especially if it does default, and potentially it will reallocate itself to other regions. So why not go for a fund that's focused on the emerging
I've
markets?
actually really, really good takes, really great insights for people to understand and digest. One of the questions I actually have for you guys is, this is actually a lot to do with the confidence in the US economy, confidence in the US dollar, and are we betting against the US dollar and the economy, given the brilliant minds that they have, the economic engine that they have? And Daniel, you mentioned that we haven't seen this level of debt before. Yes, but from what we can remember, the US has always had a high level of debt to manage. Question I have for you guys, and I'm trying to play the other side of the fence to give people really something to think about. If you borrow money to grow your economy, and your economy is growing at a higher rate than what you have to pay back, why not continue to borrow?
I think that's actually a really good take, P. And I believe when that model works, it works well. I would challenge you and say, have we started to see a slowdown or a decline in the growth? So if I look at
2.3.
GDP, I think it's the growth level is around 2%, 2.3. If I compare that to China, number 2, which is growing at, I think, 4 or 5%, right? So they're growing. So again, I always take this back to if I'm investing in a company or a stock, right? And I say, hey, I'm starting to see all the financial metrics in terms of growth showing some sort of decline or slowdown. That's when I start to worry. Now, going back to you, and I think playing the devil's advocate, is there some other way that the US can continue to grow? I personally don't bet against them, right? That's why I'm heavily invested in the S&P 500. The best companies, Amazon, Apple, innovation is always the US, right? But how long can it continue going? Like Ray Dalio always talks about, like the change in power. Like every few centuries, there's dynamic changes. The Chinese sort of great power in the empire there, the British Empire, all these empires at some point lose power, and then some other great power takes over.
Yeah.
So are we
I
going to see a turn at some point?
Sort of thinking
I
to
don't
take
know.
around this and what we've discussed is what should people pay attention to? And so one of the, because to Olu, to your point, if that continues to rise, then your ability, what your is in moving at a much faster pace than the actual economy growing. So that becomes then more alarming. I think we are seeing a point where the dollar is getting weaker in the eyes globally, but default, I think I personally think it's something that potentially won't happen. I think you've got too many it's a discussion around restructuring debt, but a default would effectively mean the collapse of the global economy. If we think about us being in the UK, the US owes us around 607 billion. So I know my take was sort of, are we worried about the US debt? I think we'll find a way to continue, which is restructure, issue more. And whilst we spoke about from a personal standpoint, how would you manage your own finances? Whilst it may not be the preferred avenue, it's a case of, debt management in terms of what you already have. So it's to remain to be seen. I think when I think a little bit about solutions, you mentioned AI earlier today. I think that's a great point. I think, looking at immigration laws and the bedrock of this economy, immigration laws, because they move a lot of there are a lot of labor, small business, increase in taxes. So there are levers that can be pulled in each situation, but I think the the question or the conversation is, are people losing confidence in the US dollar? That's because if that becomes countries, that's, I think, a big issue. If we lose confidence before there's a default, that's a big issue. I am concerned because if you have that on your debt, it means that you can't then allocate capital towards education, military, and parts of your country to further develop it. However, what I do think about when I think are in that country, what they've been able to do from an enterprise standpoint, and the ability that, so they will. It's not an ideal scenario, but they will amongst themselves figure out how to sort of manage a situation. And I just don't see the confidence as a product going down anytime soon to China. China have their other issues that they're currently dealing with. So it's down the road, which is what they've always done from a debt.
Thank you, P. For I know sometimes when we have these conversations, it's very difficult to take the other side of this, right? And I think you've addressed some really great points in terms of, look, the real importance is how much confidence do you have on the US and the dollar, and as long as that stays intact, right? All the other problems they'll figure out and solve with innovation, which they've done multiple times. We were talking about this after sort of World War One, right? About how high it was there, and they were able to innovate at that period of time and find some level of solution and productivity, which we will wait and see what happens there. So, based on that, look, I'll wrap up this episode. I think you guys we've covered some really great points in regards to what is the solution. So, what could the US government do to better manage their debt and their debt level? Daniel's talked about the potential default, what would happen to the economy, global economy, if they were to default. And P taking the other side and saying, look, is there much to worry about? How has the US got out of this problem in the past? And will they continue to find ways and solutions to get over it in the future, right? I think the US is one of those countries that I don't bet against, right? When we talked about the GDP, we talked about the gap in which it has versus first and second. So
like Elon
it's
Musk.
not a bet that I would take the other side. Maybe potentially the Elon Musk side.
Too soon.
Yeah.
Too soon.
We're gonna do a follow-up episode
It's
on
too
that.
soon.
Tesla's not looking good. Twitter's not looking good. I'm not gonna speak yet because we'll have another episode on that. But I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'll pass it on to Daniel to close us out.
So yeah, hope you've all enjoyed this episode. Very different to sort of the normal episode because it's very much US focused. But of course, as we know and as we've explained, it has a global and ripple effect across the whole of the entire world. But that will be us for this week. If you have any feedback for us, please comment on us, on our videos, on YouTube. DM us on Instagram at Take Flight Podcast. Until next week for a new episode, stay safe and God bless.
Take off, take flight with